Towson Ball this summer, and of course releasing the Peter Principles this summer, and the audio part of it earlier in the week. This guy does a lot of things with baseball as well as with the Big Ten, but here in the middle of the Midsummer Classic and the middle of the season and the trading deadline, we catch up with our old pal Seth Gruen from Bleacher Report out there in Chicago, Illinois. You can follow him at Bleacher Report as well as at Seth Gruen. That's Gruen out on Twitter. And Seth, I follow you on Twitter, and I look up, and it's always Wrigley Field. It's always full, and there's always lots of joy there on the north side because a lot of these images from last year are burnished in our minds. But, yeah, of all the stories, I know home runs are a story. The Astros are a story. I think the Red Sox-Yankees thing's a story. The Dodgers have become a story. Boy, the Cubs are a huge part of this summer story where, whether they're going to make it, whether they're ever going to get up or not, and where the Brewers are, the Chicago thing has great intrigue, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, the Cubs are always a story, whether or not they're playing well or poorly. I just think they're one of those teams that has a national following, and that's obviously thanks to having been broadcast on WGN nationally for so many years. There's a lot of interest, and I think unfortunately for Cubs fans, obviously the majority of the reporting and the storylines that have surrounded this team have dealt with just what has been an atrocious 2017 campaign.
Well, and for that's the bad news story, but there's a lot of great news stories at this All-Star break, not to mention how many good young players or great young players, potentially Hall of Fame players, that are going to be gathering in Miami. But some of these teams, the Houston Astros, are, for me, the story of the summer so far.
Sure.
And there are a lot of good stories out there, but what the Astros have done in a franchise that's sort of never done this, right? Like over 60 years, much like the Cubs last year, and the Cubs have flashed it. I know the Astros won the World Series once, but this otherworldly sort of start, this run at 110 or 115 victories, this has been something I don't think anybody could have predicted.
Yeah, and I'm sure that they're going to have, their dip this season, as every team does. It's just the nature of baseball. But I'll say this, Nestor, I think that the Astros team we're seeing this year is closer to what we thought they should have been last year.
Sure.
I don't think anyone necessarily could have predicted that they would run away with the division as they have. And, really challenged for the best record in Major League Baseball. I'm not sure, with the Dodgers there. But, the reality is that this team has gotten good pitching. They obviously have some nice young players, and they were aggressive this past offseason in free agency. So, I think all that has added up to what looks to be a World Series contender heading into the All-Star break.
Well, Red Sox have awakened since the last time you and I got together about a month and a half ago, right? I mean, we were all wondering when that would happen and when the record would catch up to their pedigree and certainly their off-season spending. But they look to be poised now to sort of distance themselves a little bit. And I know the Yankees had a nice go of it, and I still think the Yankees are going to be very much a factor in this thing for playoff berths and certainly at the trading deadline as well. But the Red Sox have sort of, distanced themselves here the last couple weeks.
Yeah, well, I think they're probably up and down the most talented team in that division. They have, they have obviously more veteran leadership than the Yankees do, which I think over the long haul certainly meets itself out. It's like you said, I think they're finally playing to the point where their record is representative of the talent they have on that roster. They added Chris Sale. I think having starting pitching is huge. This season is somewhat of a study in how important starting pitching really is when you go back to the Astros and you look at the difference between last year when Dallas Keuchel struggled and this year, and you look at the Giants, Madison Bumgarner goes on the DL. Well, it's not coincidental that that they have had a bad year as a result. I think aces are important, starting pitching is important, and the Red Sox really made a big move in trading what is the best prospect in baseball to go out and get one of the best pitchers in baseball because they felt like they needed an upgrade in that area.
Well, it certainly has added up for good things for them, but we're here in Baltimore, Seth, and, the next couple of weeks, this Machado storyline will start to sweeten itself, and I don't know whether Duquette or Angelos or Buck are going to shoot it down or not and where they are, but certainly the talk in Baltimore is about what to do, what should be done, and whether Mr. Angelos and this organization with, really only about 15 months left on Buck and Duquette at this point, and Duquette, who, of course, was forced to stay, sort of kind of against his will when he wanted to take the Blue Jays job 2 years ago. They're at a very, very tender point here with potentially the worst minor league system in all of Major League Baseball and not a lot of international resources as well. Certainly a lot of money and some of that wasted on the likes of Chris Davis, but the Orioles are in a weird spot here the next 3 weeks to sort of architect where they're going to be for the next 3 to 5 years.
Yeah, well, I think what we saw this past offseason with what Rick Hahn did is that really with one or two key trades, you can really sort of change the dynamic of that minor league system. The White Sox had one of the worst, and I think when all's said and done, by the end of the trade deadline this year, the White Sox could boast the very best farm system in baseball. The Brewers are still really, really good, and I think they'll be tough to pass up. But I think, with some adept trading and ability to manipulate and take the temperature of the market, you certainly, if you're the Orioles, could reinvigorate that system if you decide to hit the reset button and maybe look at moving Machado. Because if you're not going to sign him, given the state of the organization right now and all the factors you mentioned, you have to move him because he represents a major, major haul in minor league prospects, even if a team's only getting him for a year because he's that good. I mean, he is a game changer. He can take a team, a playoff-bound team, to that next level.
Well, and that being said, he's mired in just a horrific season right now, and that I don't think that'll stop anybody.
Talent.
Yeah, there's nobody that's not going to stop him from renting him at this point, but it certainly has affected his value to some degree. Although he's woken up a little bit this week. Yeah,
and I think certain teams play poorly. That affects a star player. I think we never truly know what's going on. Last season, we saw Bryce Harper hit around 240. Well, I think this season we know that there was something going on with him last year, whether it was that reported shoulder injury or something else. I still believe Manny Machado is one of the, let's call him one of the 5 best position players in the game today. I mean, Trout, Harper, Bryant, Machado, those guys. I mean, look, Aaron Judge is making an argument too with the way he's hit the baseball. So, Manny Machado is on that short list. He's still a franchise-type player as far as I'm concerned, and I still think teams would salivate and, trample each other for the opportunity to acquire him.
Well, let's hope the bidding is large. He is Seth Gruen. He is out at Bleacher Report. You can follow his journey out on Twitter at Seth Gruen. He's one of our defending champions in the Chicagoland area, talking some Major League Baseball here as we hit the Midsummer Classic and the Midsummer point where the trading deadline and these stories will be the stories over the next 3 weeks. 1 to 10, Seth. I mean, what do you think about the trading deadline here? Do you think it's going to get hot and bothered? Do you think we're going to have a very, very delineated group of buyers and sellers here, and certainly players that are marquee players that might or might not be? I have a feeling a week and a half, 2 weeks from now, we're going to start hearing a lot of names like Machado, maybe not Machado-esque, but there's going to be a lot of names at least dangled out there. Now, whether teams want to give up the most valued commodity, which is youth and cheap players, to believe they're all in, but there are certainly a dozen teams out there right now that harbor some real thoughts of, I got to do something here to stay in the race or something to make myself better in October once we get there if we're Houston or Washington or the Dodgers.
Yeah, I mean, first to address the question itself, I don't think we're asking it if Major League Baseball doesn't institute that second wild card. And I know that a lot of people don't like the idea that a season ends after one game, but the reality is you should be rewarded for winning your division, and I think that this second wild card spot obviously adds a lot of drama, not only in October, but this time of year, because as you alluded to, teams are having to make decisions as to whether or not they want to go after one of those spots or whether or not they want to say, hey, we're going to reset our organization a little bit and try to be sellers. But I think this year you will see definitively certain teams go after particularly some starting pitching like the Yankees. That said, you could see a team like the Cubs that is wallowing in mediocrity maybe do nothing. That would be a very unique circumstance, because I think traditionally one of the worst things you could do at the trade deadline is nothing. But when you consider the fact that the Cubs aren't going to trade any of their young players because that core is still very, very promising and could win several more World Series, they're not going to be sellers, obviously, and they're going to need to take a seriously hard look at whether or not they want to trade Eloy Jimenez, who's right now the number 8 prospect in baseball and is their best prospect in the organization, for some starting pitching, which they desperately need. I don't know that they're willing to do that, which could mean that they stand relatively pat. Look, everybody does something, right? But I think that the Cubs could be one of those teams that, doesn't really delineate itself, to answer your question. But I think it's pretty clear cut which teams are going to be buyers. I mean, you're looking at the Dodgers, you're looking at the Red Sox, the Yankees. The Brewers are an interesting case because I think they're ahead of schedule. So it'll be interesting to see what David Stearns does, because, as I said a few minutes ago, they have such a great farm system. You don't necessarily want to mortgage your future for a shot at the division this year. Don't forget, the Cubs are still lurking, and that's a really, really bad division. So things could change very quickly. But, to answer your original question, I do believe we'll see a pretty clear delineation over who's going to be a buyer and who's going to be a seller, with a few aberrations.
I think there's a whole different thing going on in the afterglow of a parade, any parade. I mean, we had one here with the Ravens almost 5 years ago now, and, it does sort of reset in your mind, like, they did win, and the Cubs won and the Royals won. This should have kind of sort of been the year the Royals could have sold off some parts, and now they've played their way back into some semblance of, hey, we could be playing in October, or we could get ourselves in. We're still in this thing. That might be the most dangerous spot in the world for them. I mean, I feel that way about the Orioles. I'd almost rather them lose a lot the next 2 weeks and just fold it up and really go in that direction than this sort of toying around with somehow, some way we're going to play 5-20 ball and sneak in and be the final wild card in a year where you don't feel like you can win. I don't think the Kansas City Royals can win the World Series this year, but I certainly think they can claw their way into a playoff position, and for that, they're probably not going to bust that thing up out there when they probably should, right?
Yeah, I mean, look, anytime that you make the wrong decision at the trade deadline, it sets your organization back. Now, if you're able to make acquisitions at the trade deadline, like let's say the Cubs did last year by going out and getting Aroldis Chapman, even though they ended up trading what is Gleyber Torres is the second best prospect in baseball right now, though he's hurt. He's going to be out for a year. He's having Tommy John surgery. That paid off, and that was worth it. But when you swing and miss, if you make those moves and let's say don't make the playoffs, it's disastrous and extremely damaging. So when you look at a team like the Royals that doesn't necessarily have the financial resources that many other teams in baseball do, and quite honestly, many other teams in that division, I think the Indians are better off. I think that the Twins are better off. I think the Tigers are better off, and I think the White Sox are better off. Obviously, I think, those teams are in what are bigger baseball markets. Kansas City might have, along with the Oakland A's, those two teams might have, the toughest time building a consistent contender, because they can't really re-sign some of their biggest free agents. But I think the Royals have sort of found their niche, and they've been able to kind of piece together some of these contenders with some Scotch tape and some duct tape. That's not to say they necessarily won a World Series that way, but you've got to be creative, and they have been. So I expect them to make the right decision upcoming, but I can't see them winning that division. So to me, it makes sense to kind of back this thing off.
He is Seth Gruen. He covers all things baseball as well as sports for Big Ten out in Chicago. You can follow his journey out at Bleacher Report as well as at Seth Gruen out on Twitter. All right, last thing for you. I mean, I know the All-Star Game and everybody's getting together here, and we're all talking about teams and players and young players, but the real story this year are the home runs, right? And I think more than that, the strikeouts and sort of pitching dominance and how nobody cares about striking out. Everybody's trying to hit a home run. And we've got all of these statistical measures now of distance and trajectory and exit velocity and all this nonsense. But there's something about the baseball, too. And, there feels like, once again, we're playing hokey-pokey to sort of juice up the scoring in baseball, right?
Yeah, I mean, look, baseball wants more scoring, so I don't necessarily think the home run ball is bad. I love the game, and I love the intricacies of the game. And it's interesting, I was sitting at brunch with a buddy of mine. He said baseball's hard to appreciate when you don't understand the intricacies, but I think the games become simpler and simpler just because it's so dominated by power pitching and power hitting. You build your bullpen with power arms, and you even build your starting staff now, preferably with power arms. So, yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting the way things have sort of manifested themselves this season. And I've read all the stuff about the different launch angles and stuff like that. I think what's really affecting a lot of this power is the shifting. Teams shift, and you really, if you're especially a left-handed hitter who doesn't have great ability to go the other way, like a Kyle Schwarber who's not playing that great, or any number of lefties in the league, you basically have to try to muscle it over the wall. So I think we're seeing a different strategic approach from hitters. And quite frankly, I think baseball, and this isn't necessarily to mitigate the number of home runs, but I think baseball is going to need to take a long, hard look at this shifting and maybe make some rules that curtail that a little bit.
He is Seth Gruen. You can follow him at Bleach Report as well as that on Twitter. And, any bold predictions for you here in a second? I mean, anything that you really think is going to happen here?
I think it's interesting that we pretty much have a very clear picture of what the playoff, what the playoffs are going to look like. But I'm going to stick with my prediction from the beginning of the season. I think the Yankees are going to represent the American League in the World Series. I still believe in them. I know that the Red Sox have kind of surged in that division, but they could easily sneak into a wild card. And
I think the Yankees are going to load up at the end of the month. I think they are going to make some deals and try to go win. I believe. Yeah,
I agree because they could use some starting. Look, everybody could use starting pitching, but they have the position player prospects to make that happen. That system's loaded. Brian Cashman did a great job, so I agree. I expect them to probably be the biggest spenders in terms of their prospects at the deadline.
Well, someone's going to be the winner on August 1st. I just wouldn't be shocked if it's the Yankees. And I think that they're the one team more than a lot of these other teams that feel like, well, I get a relief pitcher, I get a little of this or a little of that. I mean, when you're Houston or the Dodgers or the Nationals at this point, I know they want to tinker. I see the Yankees as being a team that could go a little bit more all-in than that.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think when you look at who has some of the top systems in baseball, who has some of the biggest needs at the trade deadline, and sort of all the factors that go into that outcome you alluded to, I agree. You put your finger on the Yankees for sure.
Hey, man, always a pleasure. It's always baseball season around here. It's always great to catch up with you and talk a little ball with you. We will continue to check in and see what happens in this Machado sweepstakes 2 weeks from now, right?
Yeah, you too, buddy. Thanks for having me.
Always a pleasure. Seth Gruen of Bleacher Report also does a lot of work with the Big Ten and a podcast of Big Ten Unfiltered at VSporto, but you can follow him out on Twitter. That's Gruen, Seth Gruen, joining us here from Bleacher Report. You can find me out in the Bahia Toyota Audio Vault 24 hours a day from anywhere in the world. We're down in Miami all week. Luke and I doing the All-Star game and the sand and the palm trees and all that humidity and all that good stuff going on as well. You can email me anytime, nasty@WNST.net. Much like Mr. Angelos, I am a very available individual. Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Snapchat, Instagram, and streaming live on our Facebook as well as our YouTube WNSTV channel. I really do appreciate all the feedback on the Peter Principles. The book is online. It's free. There's 8 chapters up there now, as well as on the audio side in the Bahia Toyota Audio Vault, where all of our stuff lives. The morning newspaper ships to your email inbox at 7 a.m. each and every morning. That is powered up by Planet Fitness. And if there's any breaking news at all here in July with the Orioles at the trading deadline, with the Ravens leading up to training camp, commencement in 2 weeks, you'll get it first on the WNST Tech Service. That is all brought to you by Coons Ford of Security Boulevard. And Dennis Kolatzis, our pal, will be here on Thursday from 3 until 5 with the SSV on WNST, driving you home. We are WNST.net, AM 1570 and WNST Towson, Baltimore, and we never stop talking Baltimore sports.